This video will focus on changes on the western frontier, the period of 1860 to 1900, and rise of industrialization in America. The Westward Movement. One of the big draws of the Westward Movement was farming. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of free land to anyone who would live and cultivate it for 5 years. So in other words, if you lived on it for 5 years, you improved it. It could be anything from actually farming it to just removing rocks. And you built a 14 by 14 dwelling, you got to get the land for free. If you lived on it for 6 months, you could buy it for about $1.25 an acre, which was really cheap. One group to take advantage of this was exodusters. Exodusters were African Americans who moved from post-Reconstruction South. One of the things that will draw them is also the railroads. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad will be finished. The Dawes Act was an effort to assimilate American Indians. This law was passed in 1887, and it was an effort to try to get them to own property or farm, to no longer be nomadic or follow the buffalo. It broke up reservations and distributed them as 160 acres for farming or 360 acres for grazing. The cattle industry will also rise up during this time. Cowboys were men who helped raise cattle and herd them to the market, often to train depots hundreds of miles from ranch. This was called the open range or the long drive, where they would drive the cattle north in order to get them to a railroad depot. Railroads helped transport the cattle to eastern markets, especially the meatpacking area of Chicago. And as the cities grow, there was a higher demand for beef, and so the cattle industry will boom in order to meet those demands. This is the Chisholm Trail, which was a famous path of taking the cattle from areas like Texas up to Kansas. Settlers who moved into the area, railroads will bring out workers who brought the railroad. Railroad companies sold land around the tracks to settlers cheap if they were willing to farm it. So some of the groups that would go would be homesteaders. They would build dugouts or soddies. Dugouts is where you dig into the side of the ground. A soddy is where you literally build it out of bricks made out of sod. And there were land grant acts in 1862 and in 1890 in order to build agricultural colleges to support these farmers. By 1896, it was considered that the frontier was closed. Pretty much everywhere was settled, or that at least explored. And so it will lead to Americans looking outside the continental United States for expansion. Farmers are going to be very upset with some of the railroad rates and the restrictions on the railroad. And so they're going to actually organize themselves into first a social organization, but then a political one. The organization was called the Grange. Oliver Hudson Kelley will help organize it. It was an organization for farmers to discuss educational and social issues, such as best farming techniques, best fertilizer, things like that. But it became a way to fight the railroads. This led to the Populism, or a movement of the people, in 1892. Mostly appealed to farmers and laborers. The demand for reforms for farmers, workers, and to give people a greater voice in their government. They wanted things like direct election of senators and the secret ballot, an income tax, and a limit on terms of office. At the same time, in the eastern cities, we have the rise of the Industrial Age. Why the U.S.? The U.S. became a leading industrial power between 1860 and 1920 because of a large supply of natural resources, an explosion of inventions, and growing cities that wanted new products. So let's talk about some of those inventions. One of them was a steam engine to drill for oil. This was by Edwin Drake, and it led to oil boom and oil refineries in places like Cleveland and Pittsburgh. Then you have Bessemer steel. Bessemer steel was an effective technique for transforming iron into steel. It creates a lighter, more flexible product that doesn't rust. It's originally used for railroads and farm tools, but then it's going to be used for bridges and skyscrapers, and it's going to transform the way the city looks. Edison and Westinghouse figured out how to cultivate electricity and produce a light bulb, and Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson developed the telephone. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869. It sounds wonderful to travel across the country by railroad, but the reality was it was rather uncomfortable, and you often had to change trains because different train companies had different size tracks. So you might go from one, like it'd be going from like Burke to Springfield, and then you have to switch trains to go from Springfield to Alexandria, and then you switch trains go from Alexandria into DC. And that can be very frustrating and very time consuming. Also, seats were typically just wooden benches and they weren't very comfortable. But it was a faster way to travel and it was somewhat revolutionary. Because of the railroads, we're going to develop time zones, a way to regulate the railroads to make sure that they get there at the right time. It leads to new towns and markets. And George C. Pullman becomes famous when he builds his Pullman cars, which were luxury cars that had, things like cushions on the seats. And his town is actually going to be a factory town where all the workers will work in the factory and live in the town, and everything sort of revolves around the factory. In order to regulate the railroads, the federal government will pass the Interstate Commerce Act, which says that the federal government has the right to supervise railroad activities and set up the Interstate Commerce Commission for that purpose. In other words, the federal government now has a regulatory agency that will look into anything that crosses state lines and make sure that rates are correct and that no fraud or corruption is being committed. Some of our robber barons or our captains of industry are people like Andrew Carnegie, who created a steel empire through vertical articulation, which is where you buy out all your suppliers. He also used a little bit of horizontal consolidation, where you buy out all competing producers of the same or similar products. Other individuals were J.P. Morgan, who bought United States Steel from Carnegie and was also into banking. He believed in something called a holding company, which was a corporation that does nothing but buy out stocks of other companies. They don't actually run the companies, they just own the company's stock. And then you have John D. Rockefeller, who established Standard Oil. He believed in trusts, corporations made up of companies that receive certificates entitling them to dividends on profits earned. And then we passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. It made it illegal for corporations to interfere with free interstate or international trade. In other words, if a corporation's too big, and so other companies can't compete, that's illegal. The Sherman Antitrust Act isn't going to be used very well against these robber barons. Instead, it's going to be used more against labor unions, because when they go on strike, it's considered a restraint on trade. It means that that company can't work. But later, there will be other antitrust acts, so it will actually make it so that corporations can't become too big and monopolies can't happen. This is the end of the lecture. Our next unit will be focusing on progressivism and the rise of reform after the Gilded Age.